I grew up in Alaska, a place as rugged as it is stunning. Dad always said the cold kept us sharp and tough. He built his life here, turning a rickety boat into a thriving fishing business. Work was his everything, and I think he liked the solitude of the sea. It suited his stoic nature. When Dad's new wife, Clara, entered our lives, I was still grieving Mom. Clara had the warmest smile I'd ever seen. From the first moment we met, she made me feel at home. It wasn't easy for her to join our ready-made family, but she never let on. She and Dad met at a community dance, and she joked later about how his 2 left feet didn't scare her away. "Emily, your dad could sink a ship with those dance moves, but somehow he caught me," she'd laugh, making pancakes on a Saturday morning. Clara didn't have any kids of her own, and she dived into being my stepmom without a second thought. Looking back, I guess she was what held everything together, especially when Dad was off at sea. I was close to Dad, but he wasn't much of a talker. His way of showing love was through actions, like the time he built a swing set overnight, so I'd have a surprise in the morning. "Dad, you're crazy. It's freezing out there." I remember pulling my jacket tighter, watching him out the window, working under the harsh light of a single bulb. "Nah, just determined," he'd called back, his breath clouding in the icy air. "Anything for my girl." My best friend Mia lived just down the road. She was fiery, a redhead with a temper to match. We're going to get out of this frozen wasteland. Watch me," Mia would vow, her eyes fierce. We'd sit by the fire, planning our futures in grand cities with sun and no snow. After high school, everything felt too small, too familiar. I craved something different, something warmer. California was calling, a place as sunny as Alaska was cold. I'd spent nights dreaming of beaches and palm trees, anything but ice. Dad wasn't thrilled at first. The distance bothered him. "You sure about this, Emily? California's a long way from here," Dad frowned, his hands deep in his pockets as he spoke. "Dad, I love it here, but I got to see what's out there. Plus, I can always come back." I tried to sound more confident than I felt. Clara was the one who smoothed things over, like always. "Let her go, Jack. She'll be fine. She's got your stubbornness, doesn't she?" In the end, Dad agreed, his gruff voice softer than usual. "All right, but call your old man sometimes, yeah? Don't forget where you come from." Landing in California was like stepping onto another planet. I enrolled at the university, eager to dive into my economic studies. The campus was sprawling, lush with greenery I'd only seen in magazines. My first day, I remember feeling a mix of nerves and excitement bubbling up as I navigated through crowds of students, all seeming to know exactly where they were going. I was just trying to find my first class without looking like a lost puppy. "Hey, you look a bit lost first day," a voice called out from behind. I turned to see a girl about my age, her skateboard tucked under one arm, a grin spread across her face. "Is it that obvious?" I replied, trying to muster a smile while adjusting the heavy backpack slipping off my shoulder. "Only to a fellow newbie. I'm Jess," she said, extending her free hand. "Emily, nice to meet you, Jess," I managed, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, friendly. Jess became my first friend in California. She was from San Diego, so not quite a local, but close enough to give me pointers. "You'll get used to it. Everyone's from somewhere else here," she reassured me as we walked to class together. Classes were tough, but I thrived on the challenge. Economics made sense to me. It was numbers and patterns, a language I understood well. During a group project, I caught the eye of a teaching assistant, Mark, who seemed to always find a reason to linger by my side. "You've got a sharp mind for economics. Ever consider going into finance?" Mark asked one afternoon as we reviewed my project draft. I'm more into the big picture stuff, not just moving money around, I said, not wanting to admit how little I knew about the finance world. Fair enough, but think about it. You'd be good, he nudged, a playful smirk on his face. Mark was different from anyone I'd met. He had this easy charm, a quick wit, and a smile that could disarm you in an instant. We started seeing each other outside of class, casual coffee dates that turned into long walks, talking about everything and nothing. But it wasn't all playful banter and sunsets. Sometimes I'd catch a sharpness in Mark's tone when things didn't go his way, a hint of something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Still, I brushed it off as stress or the occasional bad day. We all had them. University life passed in a blur of exams, late-night study sessions, and more time with Mark. Before I knew it, graduation was upon us. Then one day, Mark said it was time I met his mom. I was nervous, but excited to finally meet the woman he always praised. "So, you're the girl who's captured my son's heart," she said, giving me a tight hug that caught me off guard. Inside, she was all questions, poking around every part of my life from Dad's fishing business to where I went to school. "Emily, with your background and how well you and Mark get along, we should really be thinking about a wedding soon, don't you think?" she suggested over dinner, her tone casual but eyes sharp with expectation. I almost choked on my water. "Oh, that's a bit fast, isn't it?" I managed, glancing at Mark, who just smiled like it was nothing new. "Oh, not at all. When things feel right, why wait?" She pressed on, her enthusiasm making me squirm a bit in my seat. Despite the intensity, I was flattered by her approval and found myself nodding along, caught up in the moment. After Mark's proposal, things moved pretty fast. Before I knew it, we were planning a wedding. I had always imagined something small and intimate, but Mrs. White, Mark's mom, had other ideas. "I think a big wedding is what you deserve, Emily. Something to really start your life together off with a bang," Mrs. White enthused one afternoon as we pored over bridal magazines at her kitchen table. The wedding was a blur of faces, flowers, and fast-paced music. It was beautiful, sure, but by the end of the night, my feet ached and my head spun, not just from the champagne. It all felt more like Mrs. White's party than our wedding. We moved into Mrs. White's house right after the honeymoon. She insisted, "You two should save up before getting your own place. Stay with me. I have plenty of room." It made sense financially, and honestly, the house was lovely, spacious, and sunny with a big garden. The first few months, Mrs. White was the perfect host. She cooked dinners, kept the house spotless, and always had stories to tell about her younger days. But as we settled in, the dynamic began to shift. Slowly, she started asking me to help around more and more. "Emily, could you handle dinner tonight? My back is acting up something fierce," she'd say. "Of course, Mrs. White," I'd reply, happy to help out. However, helping out soon turned into taking over dinners every night, cleaning on weekends and laundry. It all became my job. I didn't mind at first. I wanted to contribute, but I started to miss my independence, my time. One evening, after a particularly long day of scrubbing and cooking, I sat down with Mark. "Do you think your mom could help out a bit more? I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed," I ventured. He was quick to defend her. "Mom's not feeling well these days, Emily. We can't expect her to do all the things she used to." "But it's a lot for me, too," I pressed, hoping he'd see my side. Mark looked frustrated. "Look, she's letting us stay here rent-free. The least we can do is make sure she's comfortable. She's done enough in her life, don't you think?" I nodded, silenced by his tone. The conversation ended there, but the workload didn't. Each request from Mrs. White piled up until I felt more like a maid than a daughter-in-law. It wasn't just the housework. Mrs. White had opinions on everything: what I wore, how I should style my hair, what Mark and I should spend our money on. Things came to a head one day over dinner. I had spent hours making what I thought was a perfect roast, her favorite. We sat down to eat, and after a few bites, Mrs. White frowned. "This meat is a bit tough, don't you think, Mark?" Mark chewed thoughtfully, then nodded. "Yeah, Mom's right. A bit tough." I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. "I followed the recipe exactly," I said, my voice sharper than intended. Mrs. White tutted. "No need to get snippy, dear. Just some constructive criticism." That night, as I washed the dishes, tears of frustration mixed with the soapy water. This wasn't the life I had imagined when I said yes to Mark. Life with Mrs. White took a sharp turn one ordinary evening. We were finishing dinner when she dropped the news like a cold splash of water. "I've been to the doctor today, and, well, it turns out I have some serious health issues. I can't keep up with the housework anymore." I glanced at Mark, searching his face for some kind of reaction. He seemed concerned but calm, as if he had been expecting this. Turning to me, he said, "Emily, I think it might be best if you quit your job to take over here, just until Mom gets better." The suggestion hit me like a ton of bricks. Quit my job? The job I love that gives me a sense of independence? "Mark, I'm not sure about this. It feels extreme," I said. He took my hand, giving it a squeeze that was meant to be reassuring. "I know it's a lot to ask, but we need to take care of my mom. It's temporary, I promise." So I did it. I quit my job, telling myself it was just for a while. But as weeks turned into months, the temporary arrangement started to feel alarmingly permanent. Mrs. White, citing her poor health, retreated completely from any household duties. Everything fell on me, from cooking and cleaning to managing every little detail of our home. I tried to keep up, to make everything perfect, so that at least she'd be happy, but it was never enough. She followed me around, pointing out spots I had missed or how the windows weren't shining enough. "Emily, you really should pay more attention to these things," she'd say, her voice sharp with disapproval. Cooking became another battlefield. No matter how carefully I followed recipes or tried new dishes, her verdict was always the same. "This is quite bland, Emily. Are you sure you added salt?" Yet every plate returned to the kitchen wiped clean, which only added to my confusion and frustration. One evening, after a particularly tough day when I had spent hours trying to get the laundry just right, I reached my breaking point. "Mark, can we talk? Your mom is never happy with what I do. I'm trying my best here." We were in our room, a small space that felt like the only escape from the constant surveillance. He looked up from his phone, his expression unreadable. "Mom's just set in her ways, Emily. She likes things a certain way. You'll get used to it." Get used to it? The words echoed in my head, bitter and sharp. "I'm not sure I want to get used to it. This isn't what I signed up for when we got married." He sighed, his patience wearing thin. "What do you want me to say, Emily? That you can stop helping my mom? She's sick. She needs us." "But what about what I need?" I pressed, my voice rising with desperation. "I need support, Mark. I need to feel like I'm more than just a maid in this house." Mark stood up, his tone final. "My mom comes first right now. She's ill, and that's just how it has to be." The old washing machine had been acting up for weeks, making more noise than a freight train. I should have known it was on its last legs, but I hoped it would hold out a little longer. That hope died the day it finally broke mid-spin with a loud bang and a shudder that shook the whole utility room. Water leaked all over the floor, and I stood there, frozen, staring at the soapy mess. Mrs. White stormed in, her face twisted in anger as soon as she saw the broken machine. "Look what you've done now. That was a high-quality machine, Emily. Your carelessness is costing us a fortune." I tried to explain. "It's been acting up for a while, Mrs. White. It was bound to break down sooner or later." "Well, you'll just have to replace it, and I expect you to pay for it," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. My heart sank. "But I don't have that kind of money right now," I said, the panic rising in my voice. "Then call your father. He can pay for it," she retorted dismissively. I hated the idea of asking Dad for money. He had already done so much for me. But Mrs. White insisted, and there was no arguing with her when she got like this. So I called Dad, explaining the situation as simply as I could, without letting on how bad things had gotten. True to form, he didn't ask any questions, just quietly agreed and transferred the money. That should have been the end of it, but it was just the beginning. Mrs. White had tasted victory, and she pushed for more. Soon, she was finding excuses for more expenses. Money for her so-called accommodations, then house repairs. "This place needs to be up to standard. I deserve to live in a nice environment," she declared one day, looking around with a critical eye. Each request for money became a production. Mrs. White made sure I looked presentable. Makeup carefully applied to hide the dark circles under my eyes. Hair done nicely before I made the video calls to Dad. She hovered just out of sight, ensuring I said the right things, smiling at the right moments. Dad, bless him, never hesitated to help, sending whatever was asked without fail. But with each transfer, I felt more trapped, more like a puppet in Mrs. White's hands. She took the phone away as soon as each call was over, cutting off any chance for me to tell Dad the real story. As months passed, the house transformed under a series of renovations that Mrs. White dictated. New furniture arrived, old wallpaper was replaced, and soon she even bought a new car to cruise around the local boutiques and malls, all funded by Dad, all at her command. Meanwhile, I was left to manage not just the endless chores, but also the mounting guilt of seeing Dad's hard-earned money being spent on luxuries while I could barely cover my own needs. Ever since the wedding, Marka had been drifting further away from the man I married. He became harsh, dismissive, and seemed to prefer the company of his friends at the bar over coming home. I had started to feel more like a nuisance than a wife, and the thought of divorce had been creeping into my mind more and more. But then I found out I was pregnant. I pushed those thoughts aside, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the news of the baby would bring us back together, soften both him and his mother. But I was wrong. When I told Mrs. White about the pregnancy, her eyes sparkled not with joy for the forthcoming grandchild, but with the anticipation of the financial leverage she now held over me. "You'll need to ask your father for more money," she said without missing a beat. "Babies are expensive, and we need to be prepared." Mark's reaction was even more disheartening. He barely looked up from his phone when I told him, and his subsequent comments about my changing body were cruel and cutting. "Looks like you're ballooning up already," he'd sneer, making me feel even more isolated and vulnerable. As the months wore on, the situation only worsened. After our son was born, I was overwhelmed. He was a beautiful, fussy infant who rarely slept through the night. I was exhausted, always trying to catch up on sleep, comfort our baby, and somehow keep up with the endless demands of housekeeping and cooking. Mrs. White and Mark expected the home to be spotless and dinner to be on the table, regardless of how little sleep I'd gotten. One afternoon, running on mere snippets of sleep, I tried to cook dinner while holding our crying son. My eyes were heavy, my arms even heavier. I set our son in his swing right next to me, hoping he'd settle just long enough for me to finish cooking, but my body had other plans. I nodded off, only to be jolted awake by the smell of burning. The casserole I had put in the oven was smoking, the kitchen filled with the acrid scent of charred food. Mrs. White rushed into the kitchen, her face contorted with anger. "What is this? Are you trying to burn the house down?" she screamed as she yanked the oven door open and pulled out the ruined dish. I just fell asleep for a moment," I stammered, trying to explain, to apologize. "That's no excuse. You're wasting food and endangering us all," she scolded fiercely. "You're not eating tonight. Maybe that'll teach you to stay awake." I was too tired to argue, too defeated to fight back. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, feeling the sting of tears in my eyes. That night, Mark came home late, reeking of alcohol. He stumbled into the nursery where I was trying to soothe our son back to sleep. The baby's crying seemed to pierce right through Mark's last nerve. "Can't you keep him quiet?" he slurred, his voice loud and harsh. "I'm trying," I whispered, my voice shaky. Mark shoved past me in fury, his shoulder hitting mine hard enough to send me stumbling into the doorframe, still holding our son. Fear and pain flashed through me, but it was the look of fright on my little boy's face that finally broke me. I had been planning my escape quietly, waiting for the right moment when everything aligned. The final trigger was the next transfer of money from Dad. Once it hit my account, I knew I had everything I needed to get away. I chose a day when I knew Mark and his mother would be out. I didn't pack much, just a bag with the essentials for me and my baby. It was hard to think I was leaving my life behind, but the thought of another day in that house was unbearable. I dressed quickly, pulling on an old jacket, and wrapping my son up warmly against the chill. I called a taxi, my hand shaking slightly as I did. The drive to the airport was the longest of my life, every minute ticking by slowly, filled with the fear of being followed or found out. At the airport, I bought our tickets with the cash I had withdrawn, using the money Dad sent. My heart pounded in my chest all the way through security and didn't settle until we were seated on the plane, the doors closed and locked for takeoff. We landed in Alaska late at night. The cold air hit me hard as we stepped off the plane, a stark reminder of the world I had left behind. I took another taxi directly to Dad's house, clutching my son to my chest, feeling his warmth and the beating of his small heart. When I rang the doorbell, it was past midnight. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically, my hair tangled, my face stained with tears. Dad opened the door, and his face, initially confused, dropped in shock when he saw the state I was in. "Emily, what's happened?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. "Dad, I need help. Please save me," I sobbed, the weight of the past months pouring out in those words. Once we were settled in the living room, Clara handed me a cup of hot tea. The warmth was a small comfort against the chill that had settled deep inside me. I began to tell them everything, the control, the abuse, how isolated I'd become. When I showed them the bruises, marks I'd hidden under clothes and makeup, Dad's face turned hard, his fists clenched in anger. "I'm calling the police and we're getting the best lawyers. No one treats my daughter like this," he said with a resolve that made me believe for the first time in a long time that everything might actually be okay. Life settled into a rhythm I hadn't known for years back here in Dad's house, with the crisp Alaskan air filling my lungs each morning. After all the legal battles, the dust finally settled. My divorce from Mark went through without a hitch, and the courts didn't go easy on him. After hearing about everything, he was fined for the abuse. Seeing justice served was a relief I can't put into words. It wasn't just about him either. The lawyers dug deep and found out that a lot of the money Dad sent to support me had been swindled by Mark and his mother, over $200,000. Can you believe it? They were ordered to pay it all back, but of course, they didn't have that kind of cash lying around. They ended up having to sell the house to cover the debts. I heard through the grapevine that Mark's been shunned by most of his friends and can't even land a decent job now. And Mrs. White? Well, she's clocking in hours at some job now, and they both downsized to a small apartment in a not-so-great part of town. It's a far cry from the life she made me miserable in. Dad and Clara have been my rocks. Clara's turned into the grandmother my son never had, and Dad, well, he's just been amazing. They adore the little guy, and having their support means I can start thinking about the future again, really planning, not just surviving. Just this morning, over coffee, Dad and I were out on the porch watching the sunrise. He turned to me, his eyes all serious but kind. "Em, you thinking about what's next? You've got a whole life ahead to rebuild." I nodded, cradling my mug. "Yeah, Dad, I am. Thinking of maybe starting a small business, something from home so I can stay with the little guy." "That's my girl," Dad said, his voice rough with pride. "You ever need help, you know where to find me." And that's just it. I do know. For the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm where I need to be. Later, I met up with Mia and a few other friends from back in the day. They all crowded around, eager to catch up, their faces full of genuine concern and happiness to have me back. "Girl, it's like you've come back from the war," Mia joked as we sat down at our old hangout spot. "I kinda did," I laughed, and it felt good to laugh about it now, to talk about my plans, about moving forward. "We're just glad you're okay, Emily, really okay," another friend chimed in, and I felt a warmth spread through me. "Yeah, I'm okay, better than okay. I'm home, I'm safe, and as I lay down each night, with my son sleeping soundly next door, I think about how we've both been given a second chance at happiness, and this time around, I'm going to make sure we grab it with both hands."